webinar. Just to let you know that there is interpretation in French and in Spanish. Y lo puedo decir en español, hay interpretación en español. Okay, everyone. So welcome to this webinar. It's a very exciting one. We have a great range of speakers. Let me introduce myself. My name is Maria from Balsera. I'm the Tax and Education Alliance Coordinator. And this is an alliance that brings together ActionAid, the Global Campaign for Education, Education International, Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and Tax Justice Network. And my colleague Julie will be talking more about it in a minute. But let me introduce you to this webinar, which, sorry, it's called Shifting the Narrative, Why We Need Progressive Taxation to Finance Education and the Role of the International Financial Institutions. We all have been living and enduring the effects of the COVID pandemic and how it has affected our economies. And it continues to cause unprecedented and devastating impacts on livelihoods around the world, especially in the global south. The managing of it, the recovery measures put in place, has seen a resurgence of fiscal consolidation across many global south countries, with International Monetary Fund promoting austerity policies. This has real effects, exacerbating inequalities, threatening to undermine the progress achieved in promoting education and other sustainable development goals. Over the last years, this has reduced the resources available for public services such as quality public education, as well as health and others. This webinar is part of the Global Days for Action on Tax Justice and Women's Rights 2022. And we would like you to tweet and to make the most of this webinar and everything that we will be sharing. The hashtag suggested will be posted also in the chat by Make Taxes Work for Women. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce you to the next speaker, who is Julie Juma from ActionAid. Julie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. As Maria has already explained what the webinar is about. So we are very pleased to host this webinar as the TaxAid Alliance. This alliance was formed under the Education Out Loud program, which is funded by the Global Partnership for Education and is managed by Oxfam IBIS. So this TaxAid Alliance connects CSO stakeholders working on tax issues with those working on education to create an effective transnational civil society response. The Alliance brings together ActionAid, Education International, Global Campaign for Education, Tax Justice Network, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and its regional networks, Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, and Tax Justice Network Africa. So this alliance integrates the voices of marginalized communities with national CSOs, such as teacher unions and tax justice alliances, and coordinates their responses across national, sub-regional, regional, and global agendas and arenas. So in the project that we are implementing, we are advocating for commitments to increase the domestic financing of public education systems in a sustainable and progressive way, so that lower income governments can achieve SDG 4. So the countries that we are working in this project are Nepal, Senegal, and Zambia. So the chronic underfunding of education has actually affected the delivery of quality inclusive public education in most low-income countries, with most of these low-income countries spending only 17% of their budgets as opposed to the recommended 20%. The impact of COVID-19 has also exacerbated the financing of education. So therefore, what we advocate for at ActionAid to ensure that governments have adequate resources to finance education, we believe that in order for these countries to finance education and achieve SDG 4, they need to increase the 4 S's. So by the 4 S's, we mean the share of the budget to a minimum of 20%. The international benchmarks peg this at 15 to 20% of the national budget. The size of the budget by increasing the tax to GDP through progressive tax reform. The sensitivity of the budget by ensuring that the budget allocation follows an equity criteria, and the scrutiny of the budget by ensuring transparency, participation, efficiency, and accountability. We believe that by countries working on these 4 S's, they should be able to adequately finance education to achieve SDG 4. So the COVID pandemic, the wars, and other crises should not be an excuse to cut spending on education. Through domestic resource mobilization, countries should be able to raise adequate funds to finance education as well as the other public services. I'm going to briefly talk about austerity policies. So over the past 40 years, austerity policies have led to cuts in the public sector workforce that have undermined the ability of governments to deliver quality public services such as health and education. So one of the austerity policies that acutely impact public services is the imposition of the public sector wage bill constraints, whose consequences are the blocking recruitment of new teachers, nurses, and other essential workers, putting strict limits to the already low pay of existing health, education, and other workers. So I'm sure we are all aware that the education sector actually needs more teachers, in particular at this time with the effects of the pandemic, whereby class sizes have to be smaller, as well as also the need to ensure that children with special needs get the attention that they require from teachers. So a study that was conducted by ActionAid, Education International, Public Services International last year in 15 countries revealed that just in those 15 countries, the recommended cuts by the IMF add up to nearly $10 billion US, which is the equivalent of cutting over 3 million frontline public sector workers. So in those 15 countries, a 1-point rise in the percentage of GDP spent on public sector wage bill would allow for the recruitment of 8 million nurses, teachers, and other workers. As I mentioned, the education sector really requires more teachers. And if these austerity policies continue to be put in place, it will be difficult for countries to achieve the SDGs. So the growing teacher gap, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa is 17 million for them to achieve the 2030 SDGs. So you can see the gap that is there and how much the public sector wage bill cuts are affecting the recruitment of teachers in these countries. So therefore, I would like to appeal to all of us to continue advocating collectively for an end to these austerity policies, and also advocating for financing for education through progressive taxation. I wish you all fruitful deliberations during this webinar, and I hope that you will all enjoy this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was a really powerful introduction. And I would like to remind all the attendees that you can use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen It might appear under more to ask questions. And as you have been doing, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. So now we have heard about the chronically underfunded education, about the need to increase the size, the share, the sensitivity and scrutiny of the budget, about the effects of the austerity policies, and you were mentioning the need for progressive taxation. So the next speaker, Liz Nelson, is from Tax Justice Network, will be talking about why is tax justice, what is tax justice, and why is it important? So over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks for Julie, because that what you said there really set up the kind of the reason, if you like, for tax justice. So yeah, I just wanted to start off just trying to describe what I and we in the tax justice movement think of what tax justice is. And when I talk about the movement, I'm thinking of, you know, a global movement, and one of the key actors in that is, of course, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, who are a partner in this TaxAid Alliance, and to all our partners in it, it's great to be on this session together. So yes, what is tax justice? It's, in a simple way, it's about reprogramming our tax systems for a fairer world for everyone. But we kind of need to get a bit more granular than that, you know, to sort of delve a little bit deeper what that means. So that's what I'm going to try and do in the next 10, 12 minutes, if you can bear with me. It's about, tax justice is really about recognizing that one size doesn't fit all, and that neutrality in tax policies, which is often the case, exacerbate inequalities and discrimination. So women and girls in particular experience structural inequality and systemic discrimination because they're often assigned economic and social roles. There are cultural imperatives rather, that exclude them from the enjoyment of rights such as good health and of public education. As carers, women and girls, be it caring in their families or on the front line of healthcare, which many have been over the last 2 years, or simply in their neighbourhoods or in their local communities, will find regressive tax regimes give them little or insufficient scope to have formal public education for the many of the reasons that Julie set out. You know, the lack of revenue for teachers, for infrastructure, for buildings, for, you know, online infrastructure. At the same time, governments may say, and often do say, they have too little revenue to spend on public education, the right to education, and thereby leaving doors open for private investment. I'll say something more about that in a moment. So why is tax justice important? Well, it's important because through the reprogramming of tax systems and rejecting the underlying ideas behind austerity, and I'm referring really here to the so-called tax consensus, which was part of the Washington Consensus. It diminishes the value of direct taxes, like income taxes, personal income taxes, and corporate income taxes, and puts a focus on consumption taxes. I think feminist and tax justice approaches, which overlap, can play a pivotal role in addressing structural and systemic inequalities, can strengthen the opportunities for those who are most marginalized, often women and girls, to fulfill the enjoyment of their rights, such as the right to education. The other thing that's, I mean, there are many things that are important about tax justice, but the other one that I really wanted to highlight, which seems to escape the private narrative, is that tax revenue is sustainable. It offers revenue that enables governments to provide public services to women and girls and to others, to everyone, on a year-by-year basis. It's not time limited. It's not by grant or by the conditionality of a loan. So that's really important. So in terms of tax justice, I mean, Julie talked about the 4 S's. I'm going to just briefly run through something that we use to frame the work of tax justice called the 4 R's. And it's about revenue, redistribution, repricing, and representation. And it describes really the pivotal role of tax. So the first one we've talked about, and Julie also mentioned about revenue is to fund, the generation of revenue at a national level funds public services, it funds infrastructure, it funds administration, buildings, transport that moves people around to work and to schools. So that's a really key fundamental part, and quite a familiar one, I think, for a lot of people. Redistribution, the second R, is there to kind of curb vertical and horizontal inequalities. So those inequalities between individuals and those inequalities between groups. And the scale of excuse me, I'll just get a glass of water. Yeah, the scale of income and wealth inequalities is, well, it's an economic reality, and it's a political issue, and that's another big issue. These tax policy are political issues, they're political decisions. So addressing them in terms of redistribution needs, our view is it needs a laser focus on wealth and exposing hidden elite and corporate wealth, so it can rebalance economic power and political influence. And so that those on the lowest incomes, again, predominantly women, often carers in some way, do not continue to subsidize economies by either paying a higher proportion of their income on tax, because it's a regressive tax around a consumption tax, or have several jobs or remain impoverished because of continuing caring responsibilities. And then that consequence of that is the loss of opportunity, and particularly around the right to education and access to public health. The third R is repricing. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but repricing is about limiting public bads, and the examples that are often cited are tobacco consumption or carbon taxing. I mean, it's a really important connection, and I think we're all very aware of it, and I think others on the panel are going to talk about the relationship between our rights as women and girls and carbon consumption and how we tax that. There are risks, obviously, of regressive aspects of carbon pricing for lower income or no income households. So any regime must include social protections, transfers, benefits, dividends of some kind. So it's not another drain on available income that could free up actual opportunity and time for education. The final R is representation. And this is about tax helping to build a healthier democratic process. So it's recognizing that what it does is kind of recognize that a higher reliance of government spending on tax revenues is strongly linked to higher quality of governance and political representation. So kind of imposing progressive taxes, especially with an emphasis on direct taxes, leads to governments being held accountable for their spending decisions. So that, you know, they're not at the beck and call of private interests. It opens opportunities for governments to provide for everyone through public services and the right to education. And I'd also add that a feminist and tax justice approach calls for, in addition to that, in terms of representation, a comprehensive reinterpretation of our relationship with the planet and with social justice at its heart. And this fourth R representation defines the state-citizen relationship and I think points to not just a social contract, but an eco-social contract. Now, I'm just going to spend 2 or 3 minutes, if I'm still okay on time, talking about, I suppose there's some of the solutions and the scale of the problem. First of all, the scale of the problem in terms of tax abuse. Over the last couple of years, we've been doing some analysis and working with others in the movement within the, you know, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, Public Services International, with researchers at what's called the GRADE project, which is around government revenue and development. I can give you some links to that later. And of course, working with the Tax Ed Alliance now to demonstrate the scale of the tax abuse that's happening. I mean, Julie talked about numbers of teachers, and I can't make this correlation for you straight away, but I'm sure you can go away and think about it. That the enjoyment of right to education is forgone by a loss of revenue. So last year we calculated from data that's available from the OECD that the scale of tax lost annually from direct tax was 483 billion a year. 312 billion of that was cross-border abuse from corporate tax abuse. And then the other 101 billion is due to offshore abuse by wealthy individuals hiding their wealth in various forms. So as I say, I haven't got that kind of calculation for you, but you can see the enormity. And the ever narrative around this is that the wealthier nations are the worst offenders. 4 of the wealthiest nations are responsible for over half of the global tax abuse each year that has to be forgone by governments. And the last thing I did want to do in the next couple of minutes is just talk about a couple of solutions. There are a number of solutions that within the tax justice movement we're looking at, Tax Justice Network as developing work on, and come up with some more kind of shortcuts in language. We refer to this as like the ABC of tax transparency. So solutions to address tax injustice. And it's about creating policies and regulatory regime for financial transparency. And very briefly, 3 elements are that, and it particularly focuses in both on corporate wealth and individual wealth and how we expose the tax abuse there. One is an automatic exchange of financial account information to end bank secrecy. So one jurisdiction, Zambia, could see where the wealth is being transported into, say, Switzerland through a proper comprehensive exchange of information there by Switzerland. Beneficial ownership, that a lot of wealth is hidden behind different current legal vehicles. We need throughout comprehensively, internationally, beneficial ownership transparency through public registers so we can all see what's happening, to end anonymous ownership of companies, trusts, foundations, And ultimately, if we can create a global asset register, we'll see who has those big yachts and where they're going. And the final point is about, which is the work we did around the state of tax justice and the scale of tax abuse, was looking at what we call country by country reporting from multinational companies to deliver accountability for corporate tax abuse. Those three measures help national governments, give them space and greater space for generating more revenue and curbing tax abuse in however it's formed. I think, Maria, I'm going to finish there because there may be questions and I may be able to pick up some points that I missed, but I am conscious I'm getting over time.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was great. So together with the 4 S's that Julie mentioned, the size, share, sensitivity, and scrutiny of the budget, now we have the 4 R's. So I'm just trying to recap a little bit, which, as Liz mentioned, are revenue, redistribution, repricing, and representation. So I think that she had made a really good account of why we need tax justice, why it is not only a matter for the economists, but it's a matter for all of us. It has a massive impact on the delivery of human rights. It has a massive impact in terms of financing for education. So now that we have heard, and also particularly in terms of gender equality, because as Jayati Ghosh said, tax justice is a gender issue, and gender justice or gender equality, it's a tax issue. So if we are serious about gender equality, if we are serious about human rights, then we need to talk tax. Now, with that, we have been talking about human rights, we have been talking about gender equality and tax justice. Now I'm going to bring you to climate justice. And for that, I'm going to introduce Teresa Anderson from ActionAid. And I would like to ask you, Teresa, what's the link with climate justice? Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Maria. I'm really glad to be on this panel to bring the climate dimension to this discussion, because it's actually really important that all of our organizations start looking ahead, if we're not already, at the implications of the climate crisis, which is getting worse, and its impact on education and public services. So in this talk, I'll be outlining, how climate change is devastating children's rights to education, how finance and public funds are key for both education and addressing climate change, and therefore why tax justice is essential to addressing the climate crisis and its impacts on education. So to start with, climate change really is devastating children's right to education. We're in a context of extreme climate injustice where the countries and the communities that have done the least to cause the climate crisis, the ones that have very little historical responsibility for the pollution that is causing climate change, these are the very same communities that are most impacted. And we see particularly marginalized communities, particularly women, are the ones who are disproportionately affected. And that is for many structural, cultural, and policy reasons, discriminations against women that make it harder for them to cope with climate change impacts. And so as a result of these many different factors, we know that when about 80% of people displaced by climate disasters are women, and that when climate disasters happen, women are many more of the people that die are women than men. And so, so that shows how there is a structural discrimination at the core here. But the costs of climate disasters are really affecting public funds available for public services, including public funds available for health and education. And that's largely because there's a huge cost of recovery and rebuilding after climate destructive disasters. after destructive climate disasters. I mean, for example, if you think about the cyclones that happened in Mozambique a few years ago, where, you know, entire cities need to rebuild, and the kind of funding and investment required to make that happen is absolutely colossal. Think about the typhoons that the Philippines, where I'm from, are constantly being exposed to. Think about the floods, where in Southern Africa right now, where communities are really struggling to recover from these floods that are still very much impacting them. And that, of course, means that there is much less national budget available for education and public services. And this is holding young people back in the long term. In addition, where families need to pay for their education, climate impacts on livelihoods and children's rights. So, for example, droughts, floods, cyclones, rising sea levels, you know, these all affect crop yields, they affect livestock, they affect family incomes. And we see that children are taken out of school earlier, where family incomes are affected because the families can't afford the school fees, especially girls. Are taken out of school earlier than their brothers. And we know when droughts happen, because girls are the ones who often are required by, you know, cultural practices or expected to fetch water, they end up having to walk long distances during drought and are taken out of school earlier. And right now, there's a terrible drought happening in the Horn of Africa right now across northern Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somaliland. And the other day, my Ethiopian colleague was relating to me how in parts of the country, the situation is just so terrible right now. There is almost no schooling taking place at all. And so that is why, you know, we really need to see finance, public funds, you know, are key for education and for addressing climate change. And the countries on the front line of the climate crisis need to, for a start, strengthen their resilience. For example, through adaptation, which could include, you know, shifting from agricultural and food systems to agroecological systems that cope better with climate change and irregular weather patterns, you know, investing and strengthening local infrastructure, ensuring social protection to help people bridge crises and avoid falling into a poverty spiral when they lose their home or income as a result of climate change. And also there's a key cost in recovery in the aftermath of disasters, particularly to address what we call climate-induced loss and damage. So both global North and global South countries also really need to transition to greener pathways. And that involves, you know, transforming energy, agriculture, transport, industry, economic systems, so that they can be fit for purpose in an era of climate change, to be gender responsive, to be inclusive. And that's also why just transitions are really important. And, you know, when we shift our systems, we need to do this in a way that is participatory, that supports marginalized people to make those transitions and to address inequality. And so climate finance is a big part of achieving climate justice, and ensuring, you know, sufficient climate finance flows is about recognizing that wealthy countries have done the most to cause the climate crisis and have the resources and the responsibility to support vulnerable countries and communities to cope with the devastating impacts that have been forced on them. And so that is why tax justice is therefore essential to address the climate crisis and its impact on education. You know, we need tax justice in the global North, for example, as referred by Liz, you know, carefully using progressive repricing tools to potentially shape behavior to address public bads, you know, that cause the climate crisis. And in particular, generating revenue so that wealthy polluting countries, you know, do contribute their fair share of climate finance to vulnerable countries. And in the global South, tax justice can help climate vulnerable countries to generate the revenue for redistribution in the form of social protection and public services, and really do the investment they need to cope with climate impacts and transition to greener pathways, and also to protect children's rights to education. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Teresa. That's great to have the climate justice angle as well there and the just transition. Really appreciate it. I would like to say that Teresa is not going to be at the very end at the Q&A session. So if you have any questions for her, please ask them in the Q&A and she will be able to type for a few more minutes. Also, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Lais, because as you know, we are having problems with the Spanish interpretation. So Lais, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you so much, Maria. To my colleagues who are joining as speakers, just to let you know that I'm giving just a very short message in Spanish. Pero bueno, hola a todos. Lo sentimos muchísimo por la interpretación en español, pero me parece que la persona tuvo un problema y realmente no logramos encontrar a otra persona. Lo sentimos muchísimo y una forma que queríamos proponerle es que eventualmente María y yo vamos a intentar resumir un poco los puntos que van a decir nuestros panelistas aquí, y entonces vamos a seguir intentar seguir con esa charla en el chat. Lo sentimos muchísimo y también de cualquier forma también tendremos un texto en los próximos días en el sitio de la GACH, de la Alianza Global por la Justicia Fiscal. Entonces esperamos que puedan seguir con nosotros, o después también podemos volver a enviarle la información. Y finalmente, solo un momento que ahora vuelvo al inglés, pero ladies, to my colleagues who are speaking, if you can speak a little bit slower, perhaps we can also continue the conversation here. Thank you so much. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Lais. Y muchas gracias a todos los que nos están siguiendo con tanta paciencia. So let's move from the climate justice. Now we are going to hear from those at the front line, the teachers, who are going to be represented by their unions. So I'm going to invite Antonia Wulff from Education International. And your question, Antonia, is what's the relation between the current education financing and the teacher gap? Over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Maria, and hello, everyone. Let me start by mentioning that today should have been the first day of the new school term in Afghanistan. And despite the promises from the Taliban, girls above the age of 11 were not allowed to go to school today. So we're going to look at teachers and the link between education financing and teachers. And I'm just going to start by taking a step backwards and kind of recall SDG 4 as the current ambition and the commitment within SDG 4 to make quality education available to all. So in a way, more people and more quality in education. And of course, when talking about quality, we are talking about quality tools, quality environments, safe learning environments for all, and of course about teachers, having teachers who are trained, who are qualified, and who are supported in the profession. And I think what's important to really mention is that with SDG 4, we have left an era behind where it was somehow seen as enough to get children into school. The focus now is really ensuring that all children complete quality education. There is an explicit commitment to free primary and secondary education, which of course also means that those governments who have and continue to rely heavily on different both direct and indirect costs of education are now obliged to rethink, which is yet another link to the theme of tax justice. So looking at the situation with teachers, we are faced with a dramatic shortage of teachers. The shortage has been dramatic for quite some time. Currently, we are missing 69 million teachers globally, and there is a specific commitment within SDG 4 to ensuring qualified teachers. And what EI has been arguing is that for as long as there are children who do not enjoy their right to a qualified teacher, we are not realizing the right to education and we are not meeting our SDG 4 commitments. And 69 million was the number before the COVID pandemic hit. What we're faced with now is an even more serious situation in many ways, with a very large number of teachers leaving the profession because of the conditions they are faced with, and struggles in a large number of countries to attract new people, a new generation of teachers into the profession. So, and I think we need to acknowledge as well that because of COVID and the related school closures, there is more need for support from teachers to students as they are coming back into education. And if there was anything that the COVID pandemic proved, it did prove the need for qualified teachers and the need for schools as physical spaces where quality education can take place. But we are faced with a funding gap, and many of you have mentioned some of the core numbers. The one I wanted to highlight was that a third of the 151 countries for which we have data in the period of 2014 to 2019 did not meet the target of 4% of GDP and or 15% of national expenditure. And here, for the record, let me clarify that Education International and many other civil society actors have called for a commitment to not 4 but 6% of GDP, and not 15 but 20% of national expenditure. So if you were to follow our assessment of what's needed, the situation is even worse. And as many of the previous speakers mentioned, we are in a context of an increasing number of governments introducing austerity policies, in part as part of the COVID pandemic and the shifts in spending that has followed. But we're also in a context of an ongoing war. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to a number of governments declaring an increase in their defense budgets, while a large number of countries are also hosting large numbers of refugees. And I think I want to mention this because I think these are likely to have a direct impact on education budgets. That money that is now going to defense has to come from somewhere. And money for hosting refugees, a part of that does come from the aid budget. So raising the question of how aid to education will be impacted in the year and the years to come. So we are faced with a serious situation and a difficult context. I also want to mention, kind of build on what Julie was saying about public wage bill constraints and the fact that the IMF continue to advise countries to introduce austerity. They continue to push countries below the average of public sector wage bill as a percentage of GDP. And what that means in education, as Julie also mentioned, is that it blocks the recruitment of new teachers, of more teachers, and it lowers or freezes the salaries of the teachers and education support personnel who are already in the system. And it goes without saying that this is a very, very serious constraint on the ability of any government to ensure quality education for all children and young people in their jurisdiction. And I wanted to share a couple of quotes from some of our members as we've been doing some research around these public sector wage bills and the impact that they are having on teachers on the ground. And I'm going to start with a teacher in Zambia. My salary is a slave salary. Our conditions of service are pathetic. My housing allowance is too low to rent a decent house. I feel the government has taken our professional commitment for granted. I'm teaching double class, which are grades 5 and 6, but I do not get any allowances for teaching such classes. Teaching several classes increases the burden on the teachers and affects focus. And here I think it's important to mention that particularly at the primary level, the great majority of teachers are female. I was just told that 98% of the primary teachers in Ukraine are female. So this tendency to take a professional commitment for granted, I think, is also interesting to look at in the broader context of how women are understood to be teachers because of this innate ability to care and because of a commitment that is just part of who we are as women, not related to us being professionals and having the same rights as anyone else and a legitimate demand for decent salaries. The next one is from Malawi. The salaries are inadequate for teachers. Now we live in the place where the prices of goods are going up every day. You end up going to debt. The whole teaching profession is like a struggle, not only at work, but also at home, trying to make ends meet. And these are the kind of the human consequences of the policies that are too common across the globe. And this is, in some ways, it's shocking that still in year 2022, we are faced with an IMF that is able to continue pushing for such policies. And as you know, the pushing is not exactly gentle, leaving very little space for some of the governments to choose a different way. And I think that's really something I want to highlight. And Liz was speaking about this as well. Tax justice as sustainable in the sense that it provides a government with that long-term stability to invest in public services, including education, including those that work in these in the public sector. And the fact that teachers keep struggling with salaries that are lower than other professions with comparable qualifications, that they find themselves forced to take a second job in many cases to make ends meet, that is just impossible if we are serious about the commitment to quality education. And I think this really goes back to what I said at the beginning. We are not interested in just getting people into schools. We need to be able to ensure that the education that children and young people access today is of quality, that it includes education about the climate change, for instance, that it's enjoyed and received by educators who work under decent working conditions, because their working conditions are the students' learning conditions. So tax justice really as the only way that we can ensure a sustainable as well as sufficient budget for public education systems. And what I want to mention as well is the necessity to look at efforts to increase tax revenue alongside efforts to increase the progressivity of taxation, really looking at that broader purpose of building more equitable societies. Again, quality education is one of the absolute best tools we have for giving people a more equal starting point. So a kind of double link there. I was going to cite some of the numbers. I think Liz did that already. So just warm agreement with the need to have that, as I think Liz said, laser focus on wealth, really looking at how we can ensure that tax is paid where profits are made and that we keep building more equitable societies. Finally, I think there is a common tendency to think of teachers as an expense. And of course, teachers often are the largest item on any education budget. That's the way it should be. And I think it's imperative that we resist the temptation to think of different kind of cheaper teacher scenarios. What we see across the globe is different ways of turning to unqualified teachers, different ways of combining classes, different ways of outsourcing some of the support services in our schools, in our education systems, all aimed at somehow minimizing the money spent. I think it's key that we shift this and we think of it as an investment. We think of it as an investment in not just the teaching profession, those who teach in their conditions and their professional development, but actually an investment in children and young people, an investment in our societies and our ability to take climate action as well. Because fundamentally, that is what we are doing. We are trying to ensure that not a single young person is deprived of their right to a qualified teacher, and that not a single young person is deprived of their right to quality climate change education too. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Antonia. That, again, a really powerful presentation. Brilliant to bring all these perspectives and the lack of teachers, the chronically underfunded education, how teachers, as the gender component, you have done a really, really good job. But this is just to say also that education financing is not only a problem in the Global South. Now we are going to be hearing the perspective of teachers from the US. And for that, I'm going to present you, to introduce you, Jan Hochadel from the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, who is also representing Public Services International. And Jan, your question is, how does tax policy and revenue issues impact the delivery of equitable education services to the public state of Connecticut? Over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. I have to start off saying one thing modern history has shown us is the work that's most often done by women, including healthcare, education, and other social services, are under-resourced and often undervalued. In our whole global society, and our communities want the public services, and they often acknowledge that they're one of our greatest assets. But what's gotten lost is the understanding that these services are necessary to protect the common good and something we have to take pride in and invest in. So how has this happened? Well, it will come to no surprise to anyone on this seminar that, and it's been mentioned many times, that the large corporations, while hopscotching across the globe, looking for countries who will provide them with the greatest wealth, while making them pay the least amount of taxes, have provided the funds that have drastically changed the narrative. Where I am in the United States, we see all sorts of ads portraying these corporations as working for the communities and paying their fair share of taxes, which unfortunately now too many people in society believe, when in fact they pay very little taxes and are doing great harm to our societies. As Liz mentioned, globally, tax cheats have deprived the public sector of more than $427 billion a year. And these corporations have gotten away with it for far too long. In my home in the United States, I live in the state of Connecticut, which is just a few miles north of New York City. And it's a very small state. It takes just a little over an hour to drive from one corner to the other. And in our state, we have some of the wealthiest communities side by side with some of the poorest communities in the nation. Connecticut is, by most measures, among the wealthiest states in the country, but it's also a state with tremendous wealth disparity. And what happens when we see such wealth disparity? Imagine, if you will, just over the border of New York City is a town called Greenwich, Connecticut. And it's, one of the wealthiest communities in America. It's home to CEOs, hedge fund managers, and celebrities. And here we see schools with the best and newest amenities, with new ventilation and heating and cooling systems, modern classrooms with the best technology, and well-paid educators. They're also among the safest schools. We see schools with bulletproof bookshelves that slide in front of windows with the push of a button. And just about 25 miles north of Greenwich is Bridgeport, one of the poorest cities in the state, if not the country, and not surprisingly, one of the least funded school systems. It has dilapidated buildings, old classrooms with little or outdated technology, poor ventilation, and very underpaid staff. The disparity in wealth in such a short distance is really just indescribable. And this is because in Connecticut, public services, including education, are funded primarily with local and state tax revenue. And the local taxes are determined by local policymakers. So the wealthier suburban towns like Greenwich use zoning laws to maintain the traditional charm of their towns, and they pass regulations that limit the number and location of multifamily homes and apartment complexes, keeping those people out. Housing values are kept high, the number of residents are kept relatively low, and so the town can afford to invest in a robust public education. The disparity between the money available for urban schools, such as Bridgeport, is also affected by the amount of land available to be taxed. And I should mention, in Connecticut, government buildings do not pay property taxes and are, of course, more prevalent in our urban areas. More importantly, some of our colleges and hospitals in Connecticut, though they often have huge endowments and cash reserves, are officially nonprofit and therefore do not pay taxes. So of the 10 poorest cities in Connecticut, 9 of them have hospitals. The 4 poorest cities have 2 hospitals each. An extreme example of this is in New London, Connecticut. It's a city of 26,000 people, and it's only on 6.6 square miles of land. It has a hospital, 3 colleges, and several government buildings. Nearly half their land is non-taxable. And so the citizens have to make up that difference. The city budget is inherently stressed, and not surprisingly, the educators are among the poorest paid in the state. There's also state taxes that go towards education, but in Connecticut, we have what's called an educational cost sharing formula, which determines the amount of funding that goes to each city or town. And apart from the fact the formula has not been modified in years, the legislators tend to make deals to get their communities more funding. Again, leaving the urban areas even more massively underfunded. So it's imperative that states like Connecticut develop a more equitable tax structure, and it also needs to look at a more equitable way to get the necessary funds to the neediest communities. Our Global Union Federation Public Service International, or PSI, along with the Tax Justice Network and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, highlighted that tax abuse is depriving countries of billions and billions in urgently needed taxes, which is holding us all back from building that better, healthier, and fair societies, which includes the great equalizer, education. One of the statistics from Liz's work that I found said, it may have been mentioned before, is that if we recovered the lost money from the tax abuse, we would have enough to pay a yearly salary of nearly 34 million nurses, or in this case, teachers. True commitment to a just society means everyone fairly contributes to how society runs through a system of taxation that is equitable. What's happening is that corporations are gaming the system, dropping their earnings into a shell corporation to hide it, because their main goal is not the common good. It's to make more wealth for their shareholders. And these so-called nonprofits earn incredible amounts of money that then they hide from the public auditors in offshore accounts or in tax shelters. And as a result, our communities, and especially women and families, are suffering the consequences. Taxes, as we all know, are meant to be equitable so that all contribute to our common good, including education. We must support a progressive taxation system to ensure that a community has enough revenue to complete that mission. Communities and those that make the policies aren't doing enough to ensure that companies help our taxpayers shoulder the revenue burden to fund our social services. And while we applaud the World Bank and the other international finance institutions for the work they've done to correct past wrongs, they must do more. Global support should focus on more than capitalist success. IFIs must also support and create public structures that will set up global communities for the long-term stability and success. The education sector, in fact, the public sector in general, is finding more college graduates are leaving the profession for more lucrative careers. The truth is that you can try tax incentives and other options to help recruit and retain teachers. However, as Julie mentioned at the beginning, nothing will be able to overcome the low salaries, the high cost of healthcare, and adequate retirement options if there's no fair tax structure. So I urge you to take a look at how funding is raised for your public structures in your education systems. Analyze who's paying their fair share of taxes for the common good and call out those who are not. Lobby your elected leaders, if you have them, to change the narrative for our communities, for our children, and for our workforce. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was incredible, really good. And that's just to show how much needed. It's not only that we need more money, it is that we need better redistribution, because the money is out there, particularly in rich countries, and still the inequalities are increasing. And what happens when we have these inequalities and we don't have enough financing, as Jan was pointing out, is that we have more privatization. And this is what's being pushed. And it's not just by chance. This is very much a political decision. And this is something that all the speakers have already mentioned. So now we are going to move again from the US all the way to Zambia. So I'm going to introduce Nalucha, Nganga Ziba, who is the country director for ActionAid Zambia. And Nalucha, your question is, what are the main challenges in securing adequate financing for education in Zambia? Nalucha, over to you. I should have probably checked when I said that Nalucha was among the speakers. She seemed to have dropped, which is slightly awkward at this point, but we are going to give Nalucha a chance to speak a little bit later. But Keshab, if you are ready, I'm going to read your question, so join me again in another adventure all the way from Zambia. Now we are going to go to Nepal, and we are going to have Professor Keshab Khadka from Tribhuvan, and I pronounced that really wrong, University in Kathmandu. And he also represents TAFTA, which is the Tax and Fiscal Justice in Asia. And the question for you is that it seems that inadequate financing of education and other public services is a worldwide problem. So now let's hear from Asia, and what are the main challenges in securing adequate financing for education and other public services in Nepal? Professor Khadka, over to you.
Thank you so much. And namaste from Nepal. Namaste to everybody. Yes, the question is very serious, and at the same time, very what you call important too, because it needs immediate address if we want more equitable society seen in the near future. The situation is that from the tax justice point of view, the inadequacy of this funding in education, the trend in underdeveloped countries, especially in this part of the world, we see that the funding, education doesn't come under the priority of government. We should say like that. Because in South Asia, the total revenue of the government has been increasing year by year. But the percentage of investment in education, it remains almost the same. And that's the one problem we are seeing here. In Nepal particularly, about 5 years back in 2015, 16, it was simply how to spell it, because in the exchange rate in Nepali and Nepal rupees and dollar, that it counts differently. So let me put it at around that 500 billion, something like that, was the total revenue, and which has been doubled now to more than 1,000 billion. In the same way, that means doubled it has been. But the investment in education as the total percentage of budget, state budget, it is simply the same figure, that is 4.2 or something, around 4%. So the treasury is increasing, but not at the same time the share of the education is increasing. This is how we see the situation here. And and on the other side of the problem, the direct taxes, regarding the direct taxes, they are more progressive. And still the higher, how to say it, most highest part of the income earners, they are simply paying at the same rate of that middle income earners. Just like after a certain amount, whatever the amount you earn, the same percentage, the slab is not increased. That is another problem, and there we are advocating that it should be gone. And the third point is that the quality of the education and the public sector education financing, that is having some problem, because the total budget regarding the total expenditure the education needs, that is something unapproachable simply on national resources and all those things, whatever the private sector invests on it, or the public sector, the budgetary provisions are there. So from the tax justice point of view, we are seeing that it is not only the tax revenue increasing in the national context, but also with the international sector also, just like UN agencies which are providing their employment in Nepal as technical advisor or something like that, they are not governed under the rule of law or rule of Nepal, and they have their own system, and that the amount or the salary they earn, it counts on Nepal, because it is the aid or grant or anything that is given in the name of Nepal, and out of that that grant, much of the things are taken away in the form of salary or technical advisor fees and all those things, and they are largely untaxed. That is also one of the points that how we are having. This is not the simple case of Nepal, and on the average, at least in South Asia, in South Asia, we are seeing these problems. Regarding the situation of education, it is very terrible in Nepal also. That let me have some data here. That the total enrollment after that higher education grant in Nepal, education grant in Nepal back in I think 2010-12, the enrollment has gone up to 97% of total school going children. But when you go to that primary level upgrading, then the poorer sections of that total enrollment, only 73% complete the primary education, while the upper class, more than 95%. And out of that percentage, when you come to a lower secondary, then it falls far below. In poorer section, it is only 59%. But while in the upper class, it is almost 90%. So, and then when we come down to higher secondary, then the situation is terrible because only 9% of the total enrollment in poorer section, they complete the higher secondary school. And but in the higher level, it is more than 60%. And regarding the university education system, Tribhuvan University, we call it, the state university or largest university in Nepal, though there are almost 10 universities in Nepal. It is the largest one and public sector also. So there we had a little bit older data. It is in 2013-14 we had done it, and only some negligible percentage, less than 1% of that poorer sections are reaching there. So this shows that there is due to this educational how to call it educational this imparting situation, the situation in Nepal is that the inequality is inbuilt one. The system goes that the poorer are less privileged, and as in other parts of the world also. So this is how we are seeing that now what we are doing, last I think 2 weeks before we had a discussion program also in this 2 days program, and in that there were member of parliaments and representative from government sector like education ministry, finance ministry, and this this federal ministry, federal structure. So, and also the teachers and that social CSOs also. So our point was that if the taxation is increased and the more amount or the more revenue is generated, even then there is no guarantee that education sector will get the expected funding. That's the problem. So how to address these things? This is the main crux of the problem to finance the education in this part of the world, which needs the national fundraising and also the international contributions in this problem. So thank you. This is what I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Khadka. Really, really appreciated to have your perspective from Nepal. And now we do have someone from Zambia who is going to be covering for Nalucha. That this is my fault. I was already informed a few minutes ago that she had been asked to see the vice president, so she couldn't say no. So hopefully she's doing some advocacy and just like taking all of these messages there. And we are going to be having Uchisi Ngulube instead, who is also part of the TaxAid Alliance, and he's based in Zambia. So Uchisi, it would be great if you could give us the context of what's the situation in Zambia regarding financing for education. Over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, so basically I'll be just filling in for Nalucha, as Maria has mentioned. She was requested to be to meet the vice president here in Zambia, so she couldn't really turn that down. But I think I'll just get straight into the Zambian context. I think some of the challenges have been highlighted already. I think from the unions, you heard about the salaries of women and teachers here in Zambia being quite inadequate. And also when you look at the teacher to pupil ratios, they are also quite high in terms of how many teachers or how many students a teacher would have to attend to here in Zambia. But I think just to take take a few steps back, looking at the various inequalities that we have here in Zambia, speaking to women and the challenges they face. I feel like these are quite cross-cutting. If you look at, for instance, the Gender Inequality Index here in Zambia, Zambia ranks about 137 out of about 162 countries as of 2019, just showing how much inequality there is here in Zambia in the context of the globe. And obviously there's need for mechanisms, especially in our taxation system, to address some of these inequalities. I think in the introduction there was a mention of the 3 R's, and redistribution was one of them. And it's important that we try to move resources from the rich to the poor, and also find a way to incorporate these gender dynamics to ensure that we are all paying our fair share of tax, and also that the tax is being spent on progressive and promoting equality here in Zambia. So I think in Zambia, looking at some of the research we've done as a TaxAid Alliance, you find that the Zambian government has been relying quite heavily on indirect taxes as compared to direct taxes, which we have deemed quite regressive, in the sense that it doesn't. I think indirect taxes don't take into account your income. It's the same across the board, and you know that women here, especially in Africa, are quite. The activities they engage in are quite on the consumption side of things. So you find that they pay more in terms of VAT, and they also earn less in terms of employment opportunities and access to finance for them to grow their businesses. So even on that side, you find that the inequalities are quite heavy on the side of women. So I think when we're looking at promoting fair taxation for women, we try to address the cultural norms that we have in Zambia. It's quite a patriarchal society that we have here in Zambia, with different traditional norms. For instance, there have been instances or examples where you find that women cannot access land or own land unless they have their husband with them. And there's also issues of unpaid care work, where we're not recognized as women are not recognized for the work that they do in homes. And as I mentioned, consumption activities are also quite, there are quite a bit of disparities between what men and women spend on consumption. So these are some of the challenges we've identified here in Zambia. And just looking at the education sector, working in the alliance as ActionAid with our partners, ZANIC, and also the teachers' unions, we're currently carrying out a study to look at how much we need to attain SDG 4 here in Zambia. And it was quite alarming, the figures that we found. So I think, as we're all aware, Zambia targets to channel about 20% of the national budget funding towards the education sector. This was the declaration signed in 2015. And I think we only met that target in that year, where we had about 20.2% of the budget going towards education. And since then, that figure has been falling quite significantly. And I think for the last national budget announcement in late last year, for the year of 2022, only about 10.4% of the national budget was going towards education. Although this was quite kind of masked in the other announcements that came with the national budget. I think if for those of you who do not know, Zambia transitioned government last year in August. And since then, the new government has introduced new policies in education, such as free education, and also hiring and building of schools and hiring of teachers, which kind of took away from the fact that we're still not adequately funding the education sector here in Zambia. And the study that ZANIC were doing basically highlighted that on average, since 2015, the funding gap here in Zambia for education was about 6.9 billion kwacha, which was quite a lot, and they projected this this average to our Agenda 2030, and they found that we would need about 103 billion kwacha just to meet the SDG 4 targets based on the 20% benchmark. And obviously, there are many solutions and many avenues for us to take as a nation to achieve this. But I think the greatest one, and it hinges on the project we're currently implementing here in Zambia, is our tax system. We need to find a way to mobilize more resources, but also fight systemic issues such as corruption, tax leakages. I think I heard a mention of beneficial ownership and double taxation. And I think those are things that the Zambian government have been prioritizing, especially now in the context of us being in so much debt. Zambia defaulted on our debt way back in 2020. And since then, we've been accruing all these interest payments on our sovereign debt. And obviously the debt is a large overhang, and it has implications across the board, not just to the education sector. So we did identify that international financial institutions such as the IMF have a big role to play, although there are opposing views on IFIs here in Zambia, mostly based on the past IMF that used to prescribe, I think, during the structural adjustment periods earlier in our development process here in Zambia. The IMF was quite frowned upon, and as you know, last year Zambia reached a staff level agreement with the IMF, and this is obviously going to have a number of implications on our financing and our development going forward. But I think there have been issues of transparency with the IMF here in Zambia. We still don't know what the terms are of this staff level agreement, both from the government side and the IMF side. So I think that's been an area of concern for us in Zambia. So I'll just try to keep it brief. Obviously, I was not prepared adequately for this presentation, but I think in a snapshot, these are some of the emerging issues here in Zambia. The free education is something that excited a lot of people, especially when it comes to decentralization of funds, because it's going all the way down to the constituencies through the CDF mechanism, which was scaled up quite significantly in the last national budget. But obviously, when it comes to issues of quality in the education sector, there will be some teething problems and teething issues that would need to be addressed for us to meet our sustainable development goals. Yeah, so I think at that, I'll just leave it at that for now. I'm sure there'll be questions in the chat box, which I will try to respond to. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you very much, Juicy. That was amazing, particularly considering that you were covering for Nalucha. Imagine you had been able to prepare this presentation. It would have been, really great. So thank you so much for referring us to the context in Zambia. So we have now heard from all the panelists, and now this is your time to ask questions. Ideally, you could be using the Q&A to type your questions. If not, you can type them on the chat, sorry. If you have done that already, please copy and paste again so we can find them more easily. I can only find one in the Q&A, and it has already been answered by Teresa. So I'm going to ask a question to all the panelists, and I'm going to give you maximum 1 minute each to reply. So you have already exposed most of the problematics that we have. Now I would like to hear what you are doing, particularly as part of the TaxAid Alliance, to solve some of these problems, or your organization, both it can be at national or at global level. And we are going to be going through the order. So I don't know whether Julie, would you like to say something about what ActionAid is doing?
Thank you very much, Maria, and thanks all for the great presentations that have been made. Yeah, so as ActionAid, as I presented earlier, our focus in the countries that we are working is we are looking at the 4S framework, as I mentioned. So we are working to ensure that countries are meeting their commitments education in line with the international benchmarks. So through the TaxAid Alliance, we are working with our partners, the ones that I've mentioned earlier that we are working with, and those who have also presented during this webinar. We are working collectively to ensure that our domestic resource mobilization agenda is linked to progressive taxation and ensure that countries meet the targets that have been set and ensure that SDG 4 targets and other SDG targets are met. Thank you. In brief, that's what I can say.
That's great. Please, would you like to go next? And then we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, so that I will ask later. Please go ahead.
Yes, sure. I think one of the important contributions is kind of almost is a combination of zooming out and looking at the policy landscape. I talked about the ABC, you know, of automatic information exchange, beneficial ownership. We can zoom in, look at those policy landscapes and zoom into, you know, the technical pieces in there, which are loopholes. I mean, there's a very strong narrative that comes out around tax justice issues, that progress is being made. But, you know, to use that analogy of a leaky bucket, if you've got a bucket with 100 holes cut into them and you only cover 99 of them, that one hole is letting out a lot of revenue, basically. So I think I'll work around the financial transparency policies, doing the analysis of what the actual numbers are, how that can impact on countries such as Zambia, such as Nepal. You know, what revenue has forgone by those governments, what it could do, some calculations like we did with around the nurses, look at that in terms of infrastructure and teachers. I think that's a really important thing. The second thing I'd say, I mean, there are a number of things, but one thing for the purpose of the webinar I'd like to highlight is, and it's not just tax justice networks doing this, this is a broad tax justice movement, is about addressing the inequities of the taxing rule rights, you know, the rights that governments have at country level. And at the moment, those tax rules are set by the OECD. We think, the tax justice movement thinks, that the tax rules need to be inclusively negotiated and should be done within the United Nations system. And we're pushing our advocacy efforts towards that, so that national governments do have, you know, can curtail tax abuse and can channel their resources into public education.
That's great. Thank you very much, please. Antonia.
So we represent teachers at all levels of the education system, and that means that part of our job is to bring teachers and education support personnel into the conversation, ensuring that teachers have a voice and that the realities that they face are considered and recalled as we have conversations, particularly at the global level, where sometimes the level of abstraction becomes very, very high. And I think we have a role in reminding people of the fact that this is about people and it's about rights, and thereby shifting the focus and challenging notions of what's possible, bringing in alternatives where some will fight hard to claim that there are no alternatives. We engage in advocacy at a number of different levels, in a number of different fora, and of course try to do research as well. So ensuring that our arguments and our demands come with some heavy evidence that makes it harder to disregard us.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Antonia. Jan, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, very much like Liz was mentioning, our work through the American Federation of Teachers, or AFT here in the United States, we are looking at the corporations that are not paying their fair share tax. An example is Yale University in downtown New Haven. They do not pay any taxes, and they have these huge endowments, and they are buying up all these, smaller places around the city, leaving even more tax deprived for the community. And so we're asking our governments to look at these nonprofits or these large corporations like Hartford Healthcare, who puts $34 billion in offshore accounts and doesn't pay their fair share taxes. So we're very heavily involved in that.
That's great. Thank you very much. Professor Khadka? You are still on mute. Could you unmute yourself, please? Okay, now, thank you.
So, and the question was in Spanish, I think, so I could not mean it out.
Yeah, so the question is, what are you doing as either as individually or as the organization, hopefully with TAFJA? What are you doing to try to solve some of these problems that you have been mentioning in your presentation?
Yeah. So what we are doing in Nepal is that first educate what tax justice is and why it is necessary in a country like Nepal. So it is mostly in university teachers community. Because most of the teachers are engaged with budget, budgetary, that preparation committee, or sometimes tax justice, taxation, government taxation body as an advisor or something like that. So we want to capture their attention that because of all these things, rigidities, that we are not doing justice to the people and to education sector very loudly. And another thing is that to bring the policy, that people in our conversations. Earlier I mentioned that we had, the members of parliament, especially from Economic and Social Committee of the House. The chairman was there, and more than 6 or 7 parliamentarians were there. They were all members of that Economic and Financial Committee of the House, and they were given all these things. And another part is why Education Ministry does not what you call table the amount of money that they need from the state treasury. So they should have a strong tabulation before the Ministry of Finance, and also the ministry people, because while they are having some limits, that there is the National Planning Commission, and it generally divides the limit of the budget, that this the ministry should do this like this and this amount. So while doing that exercise, why they do not pay these all things? So we are doing the two sides, I think. One at the local level with the local government and teachers, and another front with the policy makers and responsible person at the center. So two-prong our what you call we are doing our best to convince them, and let us see how it goes. Thank you.
Thank you. Uchisi, over to you now.
Sorry, I was responding to a question that came through the Q&A chat box. I don't know if there was another one that I might have missed. Maybe you can just repeat that.
So the question that I've been asking all the panelists first is to what are you doing at the moment to solve some of the problems that you have already presented? So what is ActionAid Zambia doing together with the partners as part of the Taxation Alliance? And you have some of it, but you could repeat some of it. Pretty good. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think as ActionAid and the Taxation Alliance, and I think I mentioned it in my response partly, is that we've been trying to work with the government institutions. So I think we had a few meetings with the Ministry of Finance earlier this year, and I think that they did indicate to us that they're prioritizing domestic resource mobilization. Obviously, this is the debt situation has had an impact on how much they need to raise if we are to overcome this large debt burden. But obviously, it's good to see that they have identified issues such as tax leakages, capital flight, and double taxation, particularly, that they are prioritizing. So I think that's something that we're trying to focus on as ActionAid, especially building on some of the research we've done in the past. I think, Maria, you would be aware of like the Sweet Nothings study on the sugarcane industry. I think even in the mining sector, partners such as Oxfam have been doing studies on double taxation in that area. And I think those are areas that we are trying to focus on in terms of taxation. But I think additionally, we've been trying to build capacity with partners, the teachers' unions, ZANIC. We've been trying to build capacity around processes that we can engage on. Just earlier this morning, we're having an engagement with about the VNR process. That's with the SDGs and the high-level panel, and how we can contribute to that. It was quite interesting to have the Ministry of National Planning there as well as part of that, and they were quite engaging and keen to work with civil society. So I think those are some of the spaces we will be trying to take advantage of, and obviously continuous research around emerging issues, as I mentioned with ZANIC and also with Zambia Tax Platform at CTPD here in Zambia. They've been assisting with some technical expertise here in Zambia just to build capacity.
I think that Uchis is having some problems now with the connection, but I think that he had mainly answered the question. So what I'm going to do now is to read the question. Well, it's actually a comment from Fidelis Solomon Ngoma, because I think it's a really good one, the one that hasn't been answered, which is a human rights-based approach is needed when addressing education and tax, one that underlines the need to redress historical and structural inequalities in order to provide access to quality education at all levels. To achieve equal access to good quality education, we need to tackle wide-ranging and persistent inequalities in society, and should include a stronger focus on how different forms of inequality intersect to produce unequal outcomes for marginalized and vulnerable groups. So I think that that's actually a really good summary. And yeah, I completely agree, to be honest. And we are running out of time. And I would like to thank you all, each of you, for your brilliant presentations, to bring the voices and the perspective from different civil society organizations, from labor movements, from academia, from the tax justice, education, climate justice, and just to say how interlinked everything is and how many of the problems could actually be solved by a progressive taxation, how much of it comes from the inadequate financing and the push for austerity, the push for privatization as a solution, which is more creating further problems in terms of inequality, which is actually exacerbating gender inequality. So I think that it is very important that we work together. And this is what we are doing as part of the Taxation Alliance, because it's no point just trying to get our voice. It's no point trying to increase just the share for education when the size remains so low and the funding actually comes with so many conditionalities, when so many countries are at risk of like debt distress, not being able to repay, and debt repayment is taking so much from the government budgets. I think that all of this is important. Of course, money is not the only solution to education. We need a lot more than that. But without money, we will really struggle to find it. And it goes the same for other human rights, not only for education. So again, thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you very much to Lais for helping us setting up the whole webinar. Again, my apologies to all the Spanish speakers. Les pido disculpas de nuevo for not sorting out the interpretation earlier. Thank you very much for your patience. I hope that the French speakers have been able to enjoy the webinar. And for all of those who would be watching it afterwards in YouTube, I hope that you find this really stimulating. I have definitely found it. And we will continue working on this. So thank you very much, everyone. Take care and keep working on this.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Namaste.
you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye.